a German-born ruler who managed to seize the Russian throne through a coup d'etat, becoming one of the most powerful women in history and one of the longest reigning rulers of all time. Sent to a foreign country at the age of 14, forced to marry the future Russian Emperor Peter, a withdrawn, violent and capricious man. Trapped in a foreign land and in a marriage she never wanted, Catherine the Great used all of her determination to study Russian politics, with the sole objective of overthrowing her husband and taking the throne. She would go on to rule for 35 years, transforming Russia into a vast empire thanks to sweeping reforms and a remarkable expansion of its borders, a rise to power that seemed unstoppable until it came to an unexpected end with her death. But how did Catherine the Great really die? How did she spend her last day? And above all, what was the true cause of her death? Catherine the Great was not her real name. She was born Sophie Friederike Auguste, the daughter of Prince Christian August and Princess Johanna Elisabeth, in a little and rural Prussian town, Stettin. The first years of her life were already incredibly difficult, and perhaps they helped forge the character we would come to know in her later years. Her mother, Johanna, was dissatisfied with everything: the life she lived, her husband's unpromising career, and even her own daughter. She could not tolerate the independent spirit that Catherine already showed from an early age. She also harshly criticised her appearance, never missing an opportunity to remind her how unattractive and how impertinent she was. The only way Catherine's mother believed she could escape the life that dissatisfied her was by arranging her daughter's marriage and sending her to a foreign country, seeing it as the family's only opportunity to gain status and prestige. On the other hand, Catherine herself was happy with that prospect. She couldn't wait to leave those four walls behind, and her relationship with her mother had become so strained that she too longed to get away from her. She was a very perceptive, lively and sharp child. Life in the small village did not match her ambitions. However, she was still only a child. Throughout the time she lived there, Catherine obeyed her mother in silence and always maintained a respectful attitude. Her German upbringing did not allow her to question authority. She received a strict Lutheran education. Unfortunately, even though she spent her childhood trying to please her mother, she continued being neglected by her, who clearly preferred her younger brother. Catherine's future was decided long before she had any say in it, and those plans began when she was only 10 years old. That was the year she met her future husband Peter for the very first time, not to mention that he was her second cousin. The people pushing for this marriage were not only Catherine's mother, who wanted to escape their stagnant life and difficult financial situation, but also Empress Elizabeth of Russia, who had chosen Peter as her heir, and King Frederick II of Prussia, who saw the marriage as an opportunity to strengthen Prussia's influence over the Russian court. Together they hoped to reinforce the alliance between Prussia and Russia while weakening Austria's influence, and Catherine found herself at the very centre of this carefully planned political strategy. Although she was only a young girl, Catherine will be very far from being a passive figure in someone else's plans. Her strong and determined character was already evident. We know that Catherine formed an extremely negative impression of Peter from the very first time she met him. Above all, she was disgusted by her future husband's habit of drinking alcohol at such a young age, as well as by his excessive obsession with the military. Physically, Peter looked unhealthy. He had a sickly appearance, a greenish complexion, and seemed frail. None of this left Catherine with a good first impression. However, just as the people around her were trying to decide her future, Catherine had a plan of her own. She knew exactly what she wanted to achieve in life, and her cleverness would exceed every expectation. After a series of meetings between the two in 1744, Catherine personally travelled to Russia to meet Peter's aunt, Empress Elizabeth. Elizabeth was delighted with her. From that moment on, Catherine behaved even more diligently. She tried to please the Empress in every possible way, as well as her future husband and the Russian people. With great determination, she devoted herself to learning the Russian language, which she still did not speak well. She even woke up in the middle of the night to repeat everything she had learned during the day. She spent countless nights studying in the freezing cold, to the point of risking a severe case of pneumonia and even death. But Catherine never missed a single opportunity to make the Russian rulers believe that they could trust her and that they should accept her. She herself wrote about this episode in her memoirs. When she was struck by pleurisy and her condition seemed to be getting worse, her mother sent a Lutheran pastor to hear her confession. Catherine, however, replied, "I don't want a Lutheran pastor, I want my Orthodox Pope." She said this to make Empress Elizabeth hold her in even higher regard. It was during that same year that she took the name by which we know her today. Obeying Elizabeth's wishes, to the point of disappointing her own father, she officially converted from Lutheranism to Russian Orthodoxy and changed her name to Catherine. With her new name also came a new life. She now found herself surrounded by influential figures, and all the prominent people around her only fueled her insatiable desire for power, but above all, her desire for redemption. The following year, the day of the wedding finally arrived. The ceremony took place on August 21st, 1745 in St. Petersburg. Catherine was 16 years old, while Peter was 17. None of Catherine's family members attended the ceremony. Through the memoirs of a count who served as Catherine's chamberlain, we know several details about the married life of the newlyweds. It was well known that Peter took a mistress shortly after the wedding ceremony, but Catherine was no different, as she herself entered into several love affairs. Not only did Catherine and Peter have no feelings of love for one another, on the contrary, Catherine could not stand her husband. She indulged him, as she would later do with many people throughout her life, but behind his back she harboured thoughts of revenge. One of Catherine's closest friends was Princess Ekaterina Dashkova, the sister of Peter's mistress, and it was through her that Catherine came into contact with several political groups opposed to Peter. Peter's behaviour had become unbearable to everyone, even to members of the little imperial court. He was violent by nature and, as I mentioned earlier, prone to heavy drinking. He also treated his wife with great hostility and never hesitated to humiliate and mistreat her in public. These behaviours had first appeared during his adolescence, but they remained with him into adulthood, where his obsession with the military world grew even stronger. He was famously obsessed with toy soldiers, to the point that, even as an adult, he spent entire days playing with them. He even went so far as to have a rat hanged from an improvised gallows because it had chewed one of his toy soldiers and damaged it. He was also a great admirer of Prussia and openly despised Russia, the very country he was destined to rule, often wearing a Prussian military uniform simply to provoke his aunt, Empress Elizabeth. His behaviour toward his wife reflected that same attitude. Nor did he feel any physical attraction toward Catherine, and as I mentioned earlier, he openly flirted with other ladies at court. For years after their marriage, Catherine remained a virgin, and no heir was born. Because Elizabeth had become increasingly frustrated by the absence of an heir, Catherine finally lost her virginity at the age of 25 with Sergei Saltykov, a well-known courtier who introduced her to the secrets of sexual life, only to break her heart by pursuing other women as well. The relationship between the two spouses was therefore marked by long periods of complete indifference, alternating with moments in which Peter blamed his wife for everything. Catherine, just as she had done during the first years of her life with her own family, learned to ignore him and to focus on what she truly wanted and on the goals she had set for herself. She devoted herself to reading and kept herself constantly informed about everything that was happening in Russia. Her only desire was to one day become empress. Despite the failure of their marriage, Catherine eventually became a mother. In 1754, she gave birth to her first son Paul, the future Emperor of Russia, although rumours immediately began circulating that his real father was Sergei Saltykov rather than Peter. Shortly after his birth, however, Empress Elizabeth took Paul away from Catherine, believing that the heir to the Russian throne should be raised under her own supervision rather than by his mother. Catherine was allowed to see him only occasionally, a separation that caused her immense pain. Yet, just as she had done so many times before, she chose not to resist. She endured the loss in silence, convinced that openly challenging Elizabeth would only jeopardize the greater goal she had been pursuing ever since she had arrived in Russia. When Empress Elizabeth of Russia died on January 5, 1762, Peter ascended the Russian throne as Peter III. Catherine officially became Empress Consort, and the couple moved into the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. In July of 1762, Peter decided to spend some time away with his closest followers at the Palace of Oranienbaum, distancing himself from Catherine, who remained in the capital. Catherine decided that this was the right moment to begin seriously plotting against her husband in order to depose him. Supported by prominent members of the court, who also wished to see a complete change in the direction of Russian politics, and who believed that Peter III was slowly losing his mind, on July 9th, Catherine went to the camp of the Izmailovsky regiment and addressed the soldiers, desperately pleading with them to protect her from the abuses of her husband. Later that same day, following this event, part of the clergy also declared its support for her. With this support, together with the allies she had already gathered, Catherine had her husband arrested and forced him to sign an act of abdication. 8 days later, Peter III died after being strangled by one of Catherine's supporters. Despite the hatred and contempt Catherine felt toward her husband, and despite everything she did to remove him from the throne, historians have reached a fairly clear conclusion: she did not secretly arrange his murder. Rather, it appears to have been an independent initiative taken by one of her closest collaborators. Catherine had learned, with extraordinary skill, how to navigate the intrigues of the imperial court, how to gather support, turn enemies into allies, and balance the interests of the many different factions that backed her. Thanks to her remarkable political ability, she even managed to bypass her young son Paul, securing not only the position of regent, but the imperial throne itself. Although Catherine was not a member of the House of Romanov by birth, she was descended from the Rurik dynasty, which had ruled Russia before the Romanovs. Finally, on September 22, 1762, she was crowned in the Dormition Cathedral in Moscow. Her reign was marked by innovation and reform, particularly in the judicial system. Catherine had been fascinated by the Enlightenment since she was young, and she understood that the gap between the ideal of an enlightened monarchy and the harsh reality of everyday life in rural Russia was enormous. She tried to address the issue of serfdom and to challenge deeply rooted prejudices, fully aware that the unbearable conditions in which the serfs lived had to be improved. Otherwise, rebellion would eventually become inevitable. At the same time, however, she was far from naive. She learned to strike a balance between her intellectual ideals and the realities of political power, and that pragmatism became one of the defining characteristics of her reign. One of the most important measures of her reign came in 1785, when Catherine issued the charter to the nobility, granting the lesser nobility the right to present petitions directly to the throne. She also exempted the nobility from compulsory state service and taxation, made their privileges hereditary, and gave them greater authority over the serfs living on their estates. The ideals of the Enlightenment, in which Catherine firmly believed had their greatest influence on politics, healthcare, and education. She came to the conclusion that the principles of the Enlightenment could never be understood by an empire made up largely of illiterate people. The population first had to be educated. Schools were opened not only for children but also for adults. Countless new hospitals were built, and cities were required to provide both physicians and pharmacies for their inhabitants. Not to mention her foreign policy. During her reign, driven by the same determination that had guided her throughout her life, Catherine expanded the Russian Empire by more than 520,000 square kilometers, incorporating New Russia, Crimea, the Northern Caucasus, Belarus, Lithuania, and Courland. The last two were acquired following two highly successful military campaigns against the Ottoman Empire, which also secured Russia permanent access to the Black Sea. Catherine became, in every sense, the heir who carried forward the legacy of Peter the Great. Catherine also had an insatiable passion for art. She introduced Western culture into Russia, commissioned the construction of monuments and palaces, became a great patron of the arts, and sent young Russians abroad to study, helping to create the conditions that would later allow artists and writers of the caliber of Leo Tolstoy to emerge. Perhaps one of Catherine's defining characteristics was that she was a hopeless romantic, deeply in love with the very idea of love itself. Her numerous relationships with different lovers are well documented, and historians generally agree that there were 12 of them. It is this part of her life, however, that raises questions about the duality of her character. Some of these relationships revealed a ruthless side of Catherine once she had gained power. Although, as a young woman, she had been deeply in love with Stanislaw August Poniatowski, she later all but forced him to accept the Polish throne, knowing that placing him there would strengthen Russian influence over Poland and ultimately serve her own political interests. So it is difficult to answer the question: was Catherine a just ruler, Or was she a ruthless one? And above all, what caused the death of one of the longest reigning female rulers in history? Catherine certainly had many enemies, most of them supporters of her husband. Throughout her reign, she was forced to suppress countless uprisings. She always did so with diplomacy whenever possible, but she was by no means a ruler without enemies, nor was she universally loved. It is also true that, considering the many love affairs she had throughout her life, often with men much younger than herself, some have suggested that her death may have been caused by a venereal disease such as syphilis, which was widespread at the time. Catherine embraced reform and progress, particularly in the field of medicine. It was well known that she took a deep interest in medical discoveries, especially advances in the treatment of venereal diseases, and some have argued that this could suggest she had personal experience with such an illness. In reality, there is no evidence to support this theory, and historians largely dismiss it, as Catherine never displayed any symptoms consistent with such a disease during her lifetime. We do know that she developed a profound fear of epidemics, a fear that began during her first year in Russia, when she nearly died from pleurisy. But, as had happened so many times throughout Catherine's life, that fear became another source of determination. When a devastating smallpox epidemic struck in 1768, she courageously ordered the use of the experimental procedure known as variolation, carried out by the British physician Thomas Dimsdale, a decision that helped curb the spread of the disease. A queen, an empress, who throughout her life was forced to make countless decisions that affected the lives of millions. That kind of responsibility inevitably takes its toll, even if she never allowed it to show. At certain moments, the weight on her shoulders must have been immense, and a life filled with so many responsibilities eventually demands its price. On November 4th, 1796, Catherine attended an evening gathering, but something that was highly unusual for her, she retired to her private chambers earlier than expected because she wasn't feeling well. The following day, according to contemporary accounts, she seemed to be feeling better. She held several meetings, including one with her advisors and another with one of her lovers, Platon Zubov. At one point, she excused herself, saying that she needed to step away for a few moments to use the toilet. The minutes passed, and the Empress still hadn't returned. Concerned by her unusually long absence, one of her valets went to check on her and found her lying unconscious on the floor. According to the descriptions left by those who witnessed the scene, her face had turned purple. The valet checked her pulse and found it to be weak, while her breathing had become laboured. The ladies in waiting and the servants lifted Catherine from the floor and carried her to her bed. By then, the court physician had arrived in haste and concluded that the Empress had suffered a severe apoplectic stroke. Several attempts were made to save her life, but none of them proved successful. The servants, her advisors, and Catherine's family were all summoned and gathered in her room, fully aware of what her fate was likely to be. The Empress never regained consciousness. She died later that evening at 9:45 p.m. from a cerebral hemorrhage caused by the stroke that had struck her so suddenly. Catherine was 67 years old. From a modern medical perspective, Catherine's death was most likely the result of a massive hemorrhagic stroke. By the age of 67, she had spent decades carrying the immense physical and psychological burden of ruling one of the largest empires in the world, making countless political and military decisions under constant pressure. Although no physician at the time could have diagnosed high blood pressure, many modern historians and medical experts consider it a plausible possibility, since chronic hypertension is the leading risk factor for the type of cerebral hemorrhage that appears to have caused her death. A sudden rupture of a blood vessel in the brain would explain her immediate collapse, the loss of consciousness from which she never recovered, and her death just hours later. Some of the legends that are still repeated today began circulating almost immediately after her death, especially the best known of them all, the claim that Catherine died after contracting a fatal infection following a sexual encounter with a horse. I want to make one thing absolutely clear. These are nothing more than myths. There is absolutely no evidence whatsoever to support them. At the beginning of 1792, Catherine's personal secretary discovered the Empress's will in which she had written down her final wishes. She requested that her body be dressed in white, with a golden crown placed upon her head, and that the official mourning period should last 6 months, not a single day longer. Her wishes were followed to the letter. On November 25th, her coffin was placed in the Grand Gallery of the palace, which was transformed into a lying-in state. Catherine's body remained there for 6 weeks, in a magnificently decorated hall guarded day and night. Representatives from cities across the Russian Empire attended her funeral, and the entire ceremony was marked by profound emotion. However, Catherine never had the opportunity to make final arrangements regarding the succession to the throne. As a result, her son Paul succeeded her as Emperor of Russia, and with his deeply absolutist approach to government, immediately dismantled many of the reforms and much of the work that Catherine had accomplished during her reign. Whether Catherine the Great was a visionary ruler or a ruthless politician is a question historians will probably continue to debate. What is certain is that she spent her entire life pursuing a goal that many believed was impossible. She endured humiliation, betrayal, loneliness, and the loss of the people closest to her, never allowing any of it to distract her from the future she had imagined for herself. By the time she died, she had transformed Russia into one of the most powerful empires in Europe, leaving behind a legacy that, more than 2 centuries later, continues to fascinate historians all over the world. See you next time for another historical case to uncover.